Christian.
Hi, Aurora.
What would you like to talk about today?
Today we're talking about craftsmanship.
Yep.
Or we should say craftspersonship, especially since you're here.
That's fair. Yeah.
So both of us like to make things. And the reason I wanted to talk about this, and I'm going to frame it, and then Aurora's going to say, that's not the frame I wanted, is that I'm an amateur. And all my life I have done a pretty good job in learning really fast to do something very complicated, because I belong to this hobby called reenacting, where we constantly try to make things that, quite frankly, were originally made by master craftspeople from 8 or 9 crafts. And we have like 96 hours and $1,000 worth of materials. I'm exaggerating, but I'm okay at this, and it has caused me to really appreciate craftsmanship. Aurora, on the other hand, well, you do your own brag. She's a professional craftsperson.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I went a completely different direction. I was thinking about writing as a craft, and I was about to say, no, of course you're a professional. People pay you to write books, which is a craft.
Oh, I was fair.
We were working up to that.
I was going to work on that later, but for now, I'm kind of talking about like touchy-feely,
literal
like
craft.
Leather work, which I actually am trained to do.
Sure.
Leather work, sewing, jewelry.
Right.
Metalwork.
Right.
Armor.
Okay.
Which.
Yes, I mean, I am a professional because I literally went to school and then I literally make my living that way. But there's definitely a gray area between professional and amateur that is, I'd say, quite hard to define, similar to the line between craft and art, which...
Okay, well, let's just go there. Let's just go there right away. What's the line?
Yeah, I mean, I think I actually have a very hot take on this, which is that, like, the line is not where people draw it, you know, and people get mad at you when you say, no, those woven baskets are also art, but I think I'm not really interested in what I'm beginning to think of more and more as a sort of misogynist, hyper-elite definition of art that is only a canvas with a painting or something that's so intellectually rarefied as to be, you know, inaccessible to most people. But, you know, I don't think that's a popular
Well, I think
opinion.
we're totally on side, which is going to make for a dull conversation. But I'll just disagree with some of your semantics to get us going.
Sure.
I'm going to say, like, I actually don't view that as elite, because I'm going to be really elite. I often think when I hear people say that sort of thing, yeah, you guys don't even really know what good art is. Like, because to me, and by the way, we've talked about this before, to me, some part of art is craft.
Right.
Like, some part of art is the technical work that was put in. I like to look at art and go like, oh my God, that was hard.
Yeah.
And
the skill,
that doesn't
my
matter
goodness,
whether
the
it was
skill.
painting
Yeah.
or jewelry and I think baskets are great. Let's go on baskets, because neither one of us does it.
That's true.
Right?
Yeah.
So I spent some time in Africa, and I was just repeatedly, utterly blown away by African basket weaving. And there was some crap basket weaving too, but I'm going to leave that aside. I'd look at baskets that were virtually watertight, that were woven of grass so fine, or had patterns woven in across a huge basket that was intended for carrying vegetables. And I'd think, like, this is freaking amazing. And once in a while I'd get to watch a woman, and yes, I see why you used the word misogynist, because the basket weavers were always women, and I'd get to watch a woman and I'd just go like, oh, that is freaking incredible, and also the patience, and also the math skill. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, and
tell me why that's
like
not art, and that's why I agree.
6 different directions I could go in this, because it galaxy brains me immediately.
We have 42 minutes. You can go in any direction you want.
But, like, textiles, where I immediately go is to, like, one of the, I think, most foundational elements of human life that both art and craft have been put into forever is textiles. And, like, I mean, we sort of take textiles for granted now, but, you know, when you reenact, when you study history, it is impossible to overstate how important clothing and textiles have been to people. And I just imagine the probably neurodivergent women standing at their looms, coming up with new ways to weave fabric and to, like, do brocade and to, you know, spin finer yarn, which I actually am very bad at. I'm not a spinner. And like, I just think so much of kind of our human society and culture is driven by that. And to say that it isn't art feels very on purpose to me.
Yeah, I'm gonna go a slightly different way because you've said that and I agree. I'm just gonna
or
say,
you can just sort of throw out the term art entirely, which I also am not delighted with.
remember, we're on craftsmanship.
Right, we're on craftsmanship.
The art day is another day.
Okay.
So I'm mostly in love, like 45% in love with a book called The Master and His Emissary, which I recommend to everyone. You have to read 900 pages of very tightly written prose with a lot of science in it. But one of the many points of Master and His Emissary is that we might be warping our brains by interacting too much with computers, which, let's face it, aren't like us. They compute different ways. And I am actually talking to a point you just raised. I wondered when I read the book, why aren't you talking about textile manufacture? Because I was like, okay, I'm in third millennium BC, Anatolia, because we know a fair amount about the weaving, then, and polyamory, but that's a whole other story. And that's the weaver woman who has 3 husbands, and they're all her dealers, and they carry her textiles, and we have all this in clay letters. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is there you are in third millennium BC, Mesopotamia, going like, yeah, I'm going to weave this fabulous thing that is going to precisely repeat X number of times. How much did that change our brains? And did the author of The Master and His Emissary not mention it because, after all, that was women's work and not as important as mathematics? But how much of math comes from
textiles?
From textiles.
Very true. Yeah. Well, I think to give, I can't remember his name. Ian McGilchrist, maybe.
It's a Mac name.
Yeah. A little bit of credit. I think people really take textiles for granted culturally, like in a way that I can't really fault him for. Like, but when you think about the complexity of the medieval weaving trade, which like will boggle your mind if you ever spend any time, like the complexity of their fabrics is so incredible. Like, people aren't even necessarily bothering to do that anymore.
Or just the internationality of it.
Yeah.
Like taking English wool to Florence because they weave it a particular way in Florence that will sell better than the way they weave it in Flanders or England. Anyway.
And the quality, like, I mean, somebody on my Facebook feed was going on a rant the other day about how, like, you know, Dupioni silk with schlubs in it is not like
it's not at all like any,
or good quality or anything anyone should be wearing. I mean, it has its place perhaps, but like, you know, the quality we think of as like handmade, you know, historically everything was handmade, and you know, if you spend some time looking at the craft of like the pre-industrial era, you know, handmade can look just as technically complex as machine made, and in some cases much more beautiful because of the way like the human hand and the human eye build organically as opposed to the mechanicalness of a machine. Now this is definitely a bit of a
well, no, it's great. I can bring this back to craft.
You'll have to keep me on track.
I can bring this back to craft because and to silversmithing because when I was a kid, my grandmother was like a low-level antique dealer and collector. She wouldn't spend more than $5 on anything. She showed me an 18th century teapot, and she pointed out to me that this had been made, not cast. It had been hammered out. And then she showed me why she hated the arts and crafts movement.
Right.
Which you know what I'm going to say.
Disagreements about it, yeah.
But where they deliberately left the hammer marks.
Right, yeah.
And my nana would go like, look, in 1770, they didn't leave the hammer marks in. They polished them all out, and it looked as if it had been cast. But I mean, now I'm going to be elitist, but I can look at a teapot and see that it was hand-hammered, even if it doesn't have hammer marks, because, as you say, it has that organic, very slight, it's not even a flaw, just it's human.
It's human, that's what it is, yeah. I mean, and I am, you know, open-minded to some degree about, like, I think there's really cool stuff that can be done with 3D printing, and, you know, I'm not out here saying, I don't ever want to see, you know, very cool 3D printed textiles, which they're doing nifty stuff with these days. For me, is there potentially an added value in a human making the whole thing with their hands? Like, yes, partly just because I feel like there's something not like inherently special about the time you can put into something, and like how that gives it sort of a magic soul all its own. But on the other hand, like we also like as capitalism sort of like drains us all of our time, like having the free time to really spend like a long period doing lots of little technical stuff with your hands, that's something that is only available to a certain subset of, people economically. So, the democratization of art craft has pros and cons to it. Like, and I definitely get stuck in the weeds on what I really think. But, there are certain things where I'm like, well, that's nice, but it's not really craft. Like, that's fine. I'm glad you're having fun making whatever that is.
Maybe we'll have a fight about this. I love what I think of as a craft. Aurora may not. Which is the whole world of modeling and military modeling and even model trains. I love it all. Make it small. And there's a lot of 3D printing in that now, and there's a lot of, it's not as permanent as leatherwork or metalwork. Like, recently built a bunch of Middle Eastern buildings, and I'm about to build a bunch of Ethiopian buildings. And, you look at period photographs, and then you try and reconstruct it, and you're using craft supplies. So it may not sound like craft, because craft supplies usually mean very temporary, paper, plastic,
sure, yeah.
Little bits of straw.
Right.
But whether you're building a train set or playing 40K or whatever, you're trying to make it look a particular way. You're trying to reproduce a village, and that, I find it very satisfying. And I think it's craft. I think there is enough complexity to it, but I wouldn't tell anyone it was art.
Well, yeah. So that's definitely
except
a
there are
fascinating...
now miniatures painters so good that I think they're artists.
They are elevated,
but I don't think
to
I
art. Right, and that's just so tricky. So I mean, there's kind of a balance between hobby craft and work craft, and that's also like not a clear delineation. Somebody who's knitting, that's usually considered hobby craft. It's very hard to sell because of how time consuming it is without a knitting machine or whatever. Even that is very time consuming. Yeah. So it's like, is knitting not a craft because you're doing it in a way that it's not really scalable as a business? I mean, no, it's still a craft. Can it be done to a level that's like incredibly elevated? Yes, absolutely.
Yes, absolutely.
Just like miniature painting. And of course you could say, like, there's a technical level of technical mastery in anything, art, craft, without getting too caught up in which is which, that is elevated, let's say, to art. Like, good Lord. Let's say there's a technical mastery level in any craft that elevates it to art, and this could actually fit well with our initial basket weaving start, right? Where you see somebody who's really done an incredible job and, like, mastered basket weaving and has a beautiful eye for color, color accents and like technical mastery, and you say, yes, that is art. That's where the craft becomes art. And I think that's an okay way to define it, because it takes the genderedness out of it, it takes the like objectness out of it. Like, I think there are people who define art as only something that is essentially useless, right? Like,
right.
It can be pretty, it can maybe express something, like it can express something intellectually, but fundamentally it cannot have a use. And I reject that.
I reject that
utterly. Reject that wholeheartedly.
I reject that utterly, and I could go off. But instead I'll say, yeah, I buy all that. You keep wandering off onto art.
You can't not. I can't not.
I was over here on craft, because I was going to say two people that I think of when I think of craft, besides you, because I do always think about you, are the armorer Jerry Klepatch, and my friend John Morris, who paints miniatures for a living. And one of the differences between them and me, beside sheer skill, is speed. So a long time ago, talking about some fairly banal forms of armoring, Jerry said, basically, like, I'm sure you can make one. It'll take you 50 hours, and it'll take me about an hour and a half. And And that sums up a whole area of craft where the professional, not just by repetition, but by I'm not sure we believe in the 10,000 hours anymore, but by having done it hundreds of times, can exactly repeat a particular motion so fast that they'll make it work while you're still going, I wonder if this will look right when I'm done. And that's a big deal. And then, I've seen John Morris paint, and he paints better than I'll ever paint, and faster. And I paint faster than most people, and that's sad. No, it isn't. It's great.
Fine.
But and his best work to me is definitely art, and even his fast, repetitive. He's painting an army for somebody. Work is really good, but not art always. In my humble opinion.
Right, not all art always.
He's going to come back and go what do you
how
mean?
dare you? Yeah. I mean, again, I have two tracks I could go off on this. I'm going to start with the textile one because, how not? And I know this is one of your hobby horses as well, but you see it in reenactors a lot where they say, oh, sewing, how hard could it be? I'll sew myself something. And then when they start doing it, they find, oh, I have no idea how to pattern this. Even this very simple pattern is much more complicated than I thought to do. Oh, my hand sewing technique sucks and it's going to take me a really long time to get better at it if I can even tolerate doing it at all. Because some people just don't have the brain for it, which I think is fine. I don't have the brain for math, other people don't have the brain for hand sewing. But I run into it with reenactors where they're like, I'll just make my own armor. And it's like, well, you'll make something.
Yes.
And maybe you'll be able to wear it. And, if you happen to be somebody who's a bit of a craft genius, who's done a lot of other crafts, often your first try can actually be pretty good. But if you're just making your first ever of something and you've never really done much of it and you have no special aptitude, it's gonna suck. So does the fact that you made it make it worth, it's still handmade, but it isn't necessarily useful as an object, and that you're still doing craft, you're doing a craft, but the difference between I have started doing something and I have done it 100 times is so great, it's so vast. And I think because again we're used to dealing with machines, and you learn how to use a machine and then you can use the machine, and then the machine, if you know how to use it and it's not broken, will do the thing correctly every time. Whereas you, a person, will take many, many iterations to really get good at something, and you'll still have bad days, which, sometimes the soldering do not smile upon you.
Yep.
There's that's just one of those things that I think leads into craft, where because we take the mechanized world for granted, the mechanized world of objects for granted so much, that people are shocked by how hard it is to do things that seem very mundane.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I have two stories. One is, so I used to reenact the American Revolution, haven't done it in a few years. And we went to a super authentic event, only about 100 people. A lot of effort went into the event. And after the event, and I won't go through what happened at the event, but we won. A light infantryman from the other side said, yeah, well, at least we hand sew all our clothes. And he was angry because they had not had a good time. And his stitches were like 1/4 of an inch long, and nothing really fit. And I thought, I didn't say, well, all my clothes are hand sewn too, even though they were. I didn't say anything, I just sort of smiled. But what I thought was please use a sewing machine. Because this leads directly to the second story. My wife, Sarah, and I were in Bath, England. This is a long time ago. And we were on a bit of a vacation. And we went into a shop, not a museum. And when we said that we were 18th century nutters, the guy behind the counter quite willingly just started laying out 18th century textiles. And he had all these handkerchiefs and he had a waistcoat and stuff. And the thing that I noticed was the superb stitching. Little tiny stitches. This is what you get when you have women you can employ all day for food. And it ruined my life, because having seen what that stitching looked like, I'm like, I should use a machine, because I can't duplicate this. Mm-hmm. And you can. I've seen your best stuff. You can duplicate it, and I almost can, because now I can sew a long straight seam elegantly. At the time I couldn't. I actually do a lot more sewing now than I did then. Long story short, there are no simple crafts. There are only simple people who think it's going to be easy, which has been me many times.
Yes. Well, now I think everything's going to be really hard, and I'm surprised when it isn't.
I just remember the arrogance with which I approached gilding the first time. It's like,
yes.
well, I bought some gold leaf and I bought some size. How hard can this be?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's an overcorrection, but I just assume that anything I do for the first time is going to be really, really hard and really annoying and have a bunch of mistakes and suck. So, like, it's not always true, but I just, like, sort of prepare myself for that. Sometimes it makes it harder to start things, but...
The story Aurora is not telling you is that as she is a professional, when people order remarkable pieces of jewelry, like recreating a medieval cross that has enamel on it. I did that. That was me ordering it from her. That she has to like guess how much that should cost, which I always think
I'm
is
very
like,
bad at. Yeah.
well, everyone is. Every craftsperson I know struggles with that. I want to tell another story really fast, and because this is sitting right here, you should all read this book. So I started into history from military history, and the last title I would ever read would be something called A Midwife's Tale. Doesn't sound military at all, and it isn't, but it is about the complexities of craft, manufacture, and life as a woman in the 18th century. And the thing I just want to bring up is one of my favorite scenes in this, by the way, this is fact, not fiction, is Martha Ballard and her 6 daughters weaving 40 yards of white linen in 6 days.
Yeah.
And I'm like...
Wow.
And she says that's all they did for 6 days.
Sure,
And that's so that a young woman can get married. That's
Yeah.
making her sheets and pillowcases and I'm like, 40 yards, 6 days.
Yeah,
I've seen
and,
people
like,
weave linen. It's not fast.
And I, on the one hand, I'm like, what a cool thing to do. And on the other hand, I'm like, it's nice that I don't have to sit and weave linen for 6 days and not do anything else. So, like, there's a balance here. But I also wonder, like, I fear what I'm about to say, but I wonder how much of the human mind could be much happier overall if we got to spend more time doing these kind of fundamental, like, I do think of textile making as a fundamental element of the human psyche at this point, which we don't think about it that way at all, but, like, if you think about human history going back a really long time, not, like, way more than 10,000 years, it's been very fundamental to the human experience, and, like, I wonder how much less angst, neuroticism, and depression we would have overall in our society if people were more connected with, like, oh, today we're going to get together as a group and weave a whole bunch of linen.
As a novelist, I think of those 7 women probably singing hymns, because they were all religious, singing hymns, talking, somebody's making tea, like, I think
it's
it would have been intensely communal.
And it's very, like, I mean, just being at a reenacting when everybody's sitting around sewing, it feels great. Everybody, like, I mean, unless your project is failing, but then it's sad. But, like, it's a very kind of healing for the psyche, genuinely. And, like, I think about that, people say touch grass, but, like, weave linen, like, compared to doom scrolling on your phone. And I think, how much, like, have we lost as a society and as individual humans, as just, like, having lost touch with these, like, everyday crafts, and, like, farming is a craft in this context, like, everything you do as a human to keep yourself alive, there's a balance, because you can end up, like, at a subsistence level of poverty where it's not fun anymore, but, like, I feel,
Can I quote you on that?
Yeah, you can. But, and I can't help but bring this back to the Luddites, because I wouldn't, if I was, I wouldn't be me. But, like, so the Luddites were a historical movement of textile workers who had been doing something called cottage industry, which meant that they worked 5 or 6 hours a day in their homes doing very high-level technical textile work, and then they had a huge amount of control over how much it was sold for, where it was sold, how much work they wanted to do, like if they were busy or it was harvest time or whatever, and they could control the rates and all of that stuff. And then industrialization came in and, like, they looked around and saw, oh, our way of life is going to be destroyed. And they had a good way of life. Like, this is the thing. They liked their way of life, and they were correct. Because textile industrialization was one of the greatest sins of the modern world. Like, it killed people in droves. It created a work day that was untenable. It killed children. Like, once they got children doing cotton ginny stuff, like, I'm not going to remember exactly, but like people were like losing fingers, and it was a nightmare, right? A literal nightmare. And it was a way that they could essentially like take agency away from workers who were specifically textile workers. And they saw it. They knew exactly what was happening. They did their protests. They did their political protests, and they did their physical protests. They were ignored, tragically ignored by everybody and the government. But like, I just think it's so interesting to focus on the fact that they knew exactly what they were going to lose, and that their way of life was pretty good. They were happy with their work-life balance, which most of us are not, let's say, most of us under like industrial capitalism are not. And like, they had a pretty good system going on. They would have probably been happier if they'd had antibiotics, but
well, let's wander off
yet.
into wide digression then, because
Sure.
you know what I'm going to say next. Most of a substantial part of the British Army during the American Revolution was not downtrodden underclass people, rum, sodomy, and the lash. It was Methodist weavers. Because out of work Midlands weavers,
Yeah.
because of exactly what you're talking about,
That's intense, yeah.
had no way of supporting themselves except to join the army. And what you end up with is an army where everyone can read or write. It wasn't like the army, by the way, of 50 years later in the Napoleonic Wars at all. It was a highly skilled, very sober,
Empowered,
and
like intellectually empowered, yeah.
And so when you read letters from British soldiers writing home, you're like, wow, these guys are literate, and he just used a Latin tag. This is a private in a line regiment. Well, they were all Methodist weavers, and they were not who you think the British Army would be. Sorry, that little factoid brought to you by my discovery at age like 30 that military history was just history. You needed to understand everything, including weaving.
Yeah. Well, and also, like, just to really highlight what I was saying, is, like, you see the disempowerment of these people where, like, suddenly they have no choice, which is what capitalism wants, right? Is to disempower us, to take away our, like, labor agency and put us into wherever they want us to be. Okay, sorry.
No, I mean, you can just spin that out and say, and then these disempowered workers go to America and try and suppress the American Revolution.
Right.
But no, that is the horrible reality of what happens to oppressed people.
Yeah. Is like they can be put into bad positions by the people in power, which is, exactly what we don't want. I mean, to take it in a tangentially related but completely different direction, if that's okay with you.
Sure. I started the British Army digression. You can take
I started the Luddites. It was going to happen. We can't talk about this stuff without Luddites. But,
I'm going to quote you on that, too.
Yes. Can't not talk about the Luddites. Anyway, one of the things I think about a lot with very elevated craft, so one of the things that I saw that like really gave me the best example of this was, it was a wood inlay floor. Mm-hmm. It was just a video of a wood inlay floor, and it was fucking incredible to watch. It was so beautiful, and of course it was in a incredibly expensive house belonging to some incredibly wealthy person. And this is where I get trapped as a like little socialist, but also like a craftsperson, where I'm like, how could we, were we to suddenly wake up and have a socialist utopia, how could we continue to make sure that people get the chance to do these very elevated, crafts, very elite crafts? Where do you get the money to, or whatever, it doesn't have to be money, but like the resources that need to go into this? Because I think to lose it would be a tragedy, but at the moment, like, now, to lose it completely would be a tragedy, but at the moment, most people don't have access to it anyway, so I'm not, like, out here saying, like, it's so great that everybody gets to see the inlaid floors, because we don't.
I had a professor in university who called this the yacht builder's dilemma.
Okay, yeah.
And he's like, you're just a schlub who works in a boatyard making yachts.
Right.
But wait, socialism isn't going to result in a lot of yachts. And I think what our professor ended up saying is, we might lose the yacht making industry.
I mean, I personally, of course, I'm not worried about yachts. Maybe there's some like very elevated craft that goes into yachts, but like.
But
But
you know
I
what
also
I'd
feel
argue?
like you could have public works that really put an elevation of craft and maybe give more people access to them. Like, you know,
I think
don't know.
because I believe, despite the fact that I am increasingly a socialist, I also realize we live in a very rich society. I would say that you and I already, in a way, represent what could happen, which is that hobbyists,
Right.
like serious hobbyists, like us, could go, let's do an inlaid floor. Because, sorry, these people exist. And
Yes.
and we could just say, like, well, in our socialist way, we're going to pick a building and we're going to do an inlaid floor in that building. And it would be more likely, I think, and I'm actually working off what I saw in Finland and Norway, is that a community might say, let's reproduce that 11th century church that used to be here.
Right, with all the...
With all the
everything.
gongs
Yeah.
and whistles. And then
Yeah.
a bunch of nutters, pardon me.
Yes.
All very lovable.
I know them.
Yes, you are.
I am one.
You are them. A bunch of nutters go like, well, I'm going to learn how to pick the right grown curved pine tree in the woods. That,
And
right?
then in 25 years...
Exactly.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
but I believe that in my lifetime I've seen enough craft saved or recreated that was basically gone. That I don't worry the way I would. When I was in my 20s, I was very into black powder rifles and the sort of battle cry that the last of the old makers were gonna go and there weren't gonna be any rifle makers.
Yeah, yeah.
But that's not what happened.
Yeah.
It turned out that serious hobbyists,
There's
it's not
always-
for the light of heart,
Yeah, yeah.
could like figure this out and could figure out how to beautifully carve the gun stocks and stuff like that. And that and all the rest of reenacting, you and me making bronze armor and stuff like that, has led me to believe that no,
There'll always be somebody.
serious nutters,
Yeah.
you know, the one that worries me, by the way, because I really do agree with you, is stonemasonry.
Well, and that's why I chose the inlaid floor thing specifically, because like the tools, the time, and the like, you know, you can to some degree make bronze armor in your basement or in your barbecue, as I once did.
As you have proven.
But, you know, to make an inlaid floor, you need, first of all, a bunch of people, you need a lot of space, you need a building that, like, is
Deserves it.
Yeah, that deserves it, blah, blah, blah. So, like, that's where you get into big infrastructure. And, like, I agree that to some extent, like, there's always going to be a wonderful craft obsessive who is going to be like, you know what we need to do? We need to figure out how to make those inlaid floors that we haven't been making. Like, I'm going to figure it out. And, like, I agree. That person will always exist. As long as your society has enough infrastructure to support that. And I mean, like, I'm going to go back on my hobby horse and say, I only get to be a jeweler because I live in a society that has healthcare. And I'm not kidding. Like, I have been a very, like, economically marginal, hopping along, doing my craft for whatever, 15
Literally
years. Literally hopping. And I have an autoimmune disease, and if I didn't have access to, you know, publicly funded healthcare, I would have to have some job that could give me healthcare, and I would not get to do this, right? So the more your society supports the people in it, the more people are able to pursue craft and art that, like, you know, our other friend Kate McLean, who also has health issues and is a very good artist, is exactly in the same boat as me. So I think about all the people in societies that don't have the resources that ours do, who would love to be an artist, but they just get, like, crushed into some kind of corporate mold because that's just not available. Like, because you gotta have the health insurance or whatever, you know
like
what I mean?
possibly all women for the last 20,000 years. But that's a whole other...
Well, I don't know. Like, I mean, you know, I'm reading The Dawn of Everything because you told me to, which is incredible. And, you know, they just started to touch on it because I'm only like a third of the way through, but, you know, they were just talking about the amount of work that was done by women, probably the amount of, like, farm work, but not like farm labor, intellectual farm work of, like, I wonder what happens when we grow this over
remember
here.
that part, yeah.
And again, to bring it back to the
What if we move these
textiles.
plants from the edge of the swamp to this field?
What if we grow them next to this other thing? Then what happens, right? Like, and that's labor, but that's also, like, fun. When you're doing it in an environment where you're like, oh, let's play around with this, let's experiment. And when you're doing textiles in an environment where you're like, I wonder what happens if I, like, dye this color, but with this thing, this mordant added to it. That's very interesting. Like, I think the people who like that kind of thing, such as myself, just enjoy that, and it makes us happy, right? And we're happy to, and it, like,
helps push
along society, and like usually the person doing it is having a good time when they get to do it on their own terms. You know, when they're not trapped in a lab being yelled at by their funding to do it faster.
Which is being cut off.
Could be cut off at any moment, and like having to desperately write grants to somebody. You know what I mean? Like, so I don't know. I don't know where we started that little tangent.
You have successfully digressed so far. I'm not sure I can bring you back.
Okay. Well, yeah. Well, we've really covered all the bases.
No, we haven't. There's a million other things we could talk about.
So many other bases.
Because what we didn't talk about at all.
Yes.
Is your jewelry and my writing.
Oh, right. And we should talk about writing.
So I'm going to talk about writing just a little bit, and it is going to have to be a little bit. So, long story short, I write books for a living, and one of the part of this I want to talk about, because it entertains me, is the quaint belief by almost everybody on the planet, from new writers to the publishing industry, that your first book is your best book. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because we're talking about craftsmanship, and I don't think you would argue that your first piece of jewelry was your best piece of jewelry.
It's usually going to suck.
And I know there are 0 armorers and 0 costumers who would say that their first X was their best X.
Yeah.
So I find it remarkable that anybody in the industry thinks their first book is going to be their best book. I'm on my 53rd book, and I like to think that they get better every book. They definitely get better every 5 books. And I now read back, because I have to go back in the series when I'm sort of catching up, and I go. And it's not just that my belief systems have changed a little bit or that it's dated. It's just, it wasn't as well written. And anyway, and I'm wondering if you look at your jewelry from 2018 and go, wow, I could do this so much better now. Or...
Well, I have two sides of that. And one is like, I think the assumption with writers is the kind of the world assumption is like, well, you've been writing by yourself for 20 years.
In a closet.
So this isn't really your first book, right? You know, but I sort of would reject that a little bit because, you know, if you've been just writing kind of for yourself and whoever you can get to read it, it's very different than having a publisher, an editor, you know, and like public feedback. So, you know, yes, of course, you've probably been writing a lot before you get your first book out. It still is a very different experience to have something that is in the public, and the experience of that and the way that forces you to should in theory force you to elevate your work compared to like showing it to your mom.
Yeah.
Right? Who should be supportive. We hope your mom is supportive. And like, yeah, in terms of jewelry, it's tricky because I definitely like had a strong aptitude for craft. I mean, when I think about my early sewing projects, they were quite funny. None of them survive. You know, I had some truly spectacular fails. When I think about jewelry, because I was in school, it was sort of you've been, you know, writing in a closet for 20 years, yeah. Right? So like, and because you're in school and you have teachers pushing you and giving you feedback and like, you know, so you're never doing it kind of the same way I would when I was teaching myself to sew and just like off in the universe being like, how does patterning work? So there's definitely a difference between when you're starting from, you know, in an institution that's teaching you versus whatever. Certainly my design sense has refined incredibly, partly because it had to and partly because, well, mostly because it had to, because I needed to sell things. And like you develop more of an eye over time, you develop a sense of like, you know, obviously everything is going to be a little bit subjective, but you get a sense of what other people like, and you know, if enough other people like it, you can get a sense that like it's probably decent, and that's a good direction to go in. And like, yeah, you just can't have that at the beginning because like you just don't have the data. Right. So even if your technical skills are pretty good, like you don't have the feedback data, the experience of putting whatever your work is out into the world and getting yelled at or whatever, that like, you know, or not selling it, that tells you like where you should be going, you know. And I think there's definitely like a conversation there in terms of how we are pushed by society to change art. I think there's a kind of an idea that like pure art should have no reference to the audience, and I think that's insane, personally, which could probably get me in trouble. But in the same way that I think craft can be elevated to art if the skill level is high enough, but just because it's useful doesn't mean it isn't art. Saying, well, if your art is in reference to your audience, it's not art. I don't know about that. I don't know that I agree with that. Though maybe that's where a certain type of intellectual would say, oh, no, then it's craft.
See, no,
right?
But I wanted to pick up on this mostly because of an experience I had earlier today where a very good artist, who shall remain unnamed, was very unhappy because she had received some pretty nasty criticism. So here's a thing that I think is worth discussing while we're on craft and art, which is that when you make something, whether you're making books or jewelry, when you make something that is put in the public eye, in the modern world of social media, you leave yourself open to a level of criticism that people who don't do these things will never hear. And it requires a certain resilience. So when what you're talking about, my dad used to talk about this all the time, is this continuum between audience responsiveness and artistic pride. So at the pride end, you're like, don't need your opinion, I make this for me, take it or leave it. And
then you don't need to
at
make a
the
living.
audience response level is sort of the modern TV comedian who's like, I live or die by audience response.
Yeah.
Right? And I think everybody in the arts and the craft world falls somewhere on the spectrum. And I think that on the one hand, you have to develop a lot of resilience to know when to say, no, I think I'll stand on this. This is just fine. Even though some people are saying some things. And then on the other hand, to say, well, some people have said some things. That sounds useful. I'll respond to that. And that's maybe an art all by itself. It's like, and by the way, it's also sort of in the heart of any social skill.
Well, I'm going to tie this back to martial arts now.
Let's go.
You know...
We have 5 minutes.
Great. I can do this in 5 minutes, no problem. So, what I think makes a true craftsperson is the ability to look at your own work and be like, I can do better. Because like when you're in school, you have your teachers to do that for you, and it's more or less annoying. But if you're going to continue to get good at something, at anything, at martial arts, at any craft, writing, art, whatever, you need to have a standard, first of all, that is reference to the outside world and to yourself. If you're too reference to the outside world, you'll just go insane. But you do have to have your own standard that says, I could have painted that stroke better, next time I'm going to do it this way. Oh, I could have set that stone better, next time I'm going to do it this way. I'm going to tweak that, I think I need a different tool for that. I need to spend more time, I'll just take it out and do it again. Like, if you don't have that, and especially in martial arts as well, you just will never be good at anything. And I mean, that's actually okay, it's fine. Like, and maybe that's really the thing that separates the amateur from the master, is that, like, if you don't have that little voice that's saying, I need to do better on that one for the next round, and here's where, in martial arts or whatever, you just can't get better. And, probably an intellectual component, but there's also an ability to kind of see outside yourself, and there's an ability to take your ego out of it.
So I just want to cut in and say, I think what you're talking about, in part, is honesty. Is saying, like, I didn't do that well. Which,
exactly.
Let's face it, that's actually hard.
Yeah.
Especially when you mostly do it well.
Mm-hmm.
And now and I'm talking about being at a fairly high level and trying to get to an even higher level.
Yeah.
And you're like, but I can win tournaments.
Right.
I'm sticking with the martial arts metaphor. Did we mention that both of us teach martial arts? Anyway, you're like, but I can win tournaments. Well, does that mean I'm done? And I have to stick this in because there's always a personal story. So while I was in Greece, I, as usual, did way more straight-on martial arts practice than I do at home.
Yeah.
An hour a day, beautiful. Anyway, it's just a beautiful place to just do forms, and I made up some new forms, and I discovered I won't describe them, but 2 dumb flaws and so I spent 2 weeks trying to cure these 2 things. And that's the world for me. Like whether
Yeah.
it's writing or sewing or whatever. And I was very proud of myself for finding them.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I also had a good laugh at myself, like how many years have I done these two things wrong?
But there's a level of skill in anything, probably anything, maybe not any, where there's nobody around, like, there's probably somebody in the world who's better than you, but they're living their own life, and you can't make them watch you do it every day. I can't go bother my old teachers at George Brown and be like, is this good enough? What should I, I have to be able to internalize that for myself. I can't go find some martial artist who's, like, much better than me and, like, bother them every day. What am I doing wrong? What am I doing wrong? Because, like, that's untenable. I need to be able to do that for myself. And, like, we all do, and what you need to be able to do is two things. You need to be, super honest, but you also need to be able to get your ego out of it. Because if your ego is just saying, no, like, I have to be perfect all the time, you just can't get better.
Oh, that's absolutely true. But the other thing I realized while I was in Greece is that you also need time.
Leisure. I was going to say leisure,
Because you and I are always teaching classes.
Yeah.
And so we're not on a rock in Greece doing the form I was doing like 10 times.
Right.
And going like, wow, I do this weird. Why do we do this in the form? No, I'm serious. Like, and I have not asked those questions in 3 years. Yeah,
because you're just so head down. Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. Like, to some extent, it can be easier to do it in your career because you have to. Like, you really, like, there's no escape. Like, if you don't keep getting better, you're not going to get work or whatever.
Yeah.
Though I guess you could get good enough and just stay at good enough, which is also fine. But there's still going to be that, like, that travel up to that point. But, like, somebody, apparently, Zuckerberg does, like, 2 hours of BJJ a day to cope with stress or whatever, and I was like, wow, the fucking privilege. Imagine that. Imagine being able to do 2 hours of leisure activity every day. Like, fuck yourself. but also, like, just having the, like, mental space, the like vacation time, the, like, energy to actually focus on what could I do to improve. Like, I've been noticing, because I've been so head down with work for quite some time now, it's very hard for me to come out and be like, oh, I want to make a couple new things, like, to add to my, and, like, it's so hard to have the creative energy to, like, push yourself or analyze yourself when you're always, like, grinding along.
See, I'm 62 and I'm starting to have that time, so I sandbox writing.
Yeah.
And you'll never see it, but I write. Actually, some of the stories that I meant as sandboxing are now out in the world.
Yeah,
like beyond the fringe.
Like, this is good enough.
But, but sometimes they're not, and I've written comic stories and horror stories and just sort of playing around. All of which is to get back to, in my, like, ultimate way, because we need to wrap up.
Yep.
Craft is about time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's about time in every direction, by which I mean, this is just my theory, it's about learning to be faster at what you're doing, but at the same time, it's about having the time to look at new ways. Like that, your description of, a woman going like, I wonder if we can move those plants over here. And I wonder, that's a time thing.
Sure.
And then it's about that inlaid floor where one of the things you need to do when you're looking at that floor is go, well, this is going to take us like 4 years.
And also be able to say, that part isn't good enough, we have to do it again. Which...
Oh, I hate that part.
I hate it, but it happens all the time. Like, that's the thing with craft. You have to be prepared to go in and be like, oh, that's going to cost us another $2,000, but we're going to have to do it again.
Worst I've ever done is to lose 5,000 words, but I've lost 5,000 words.
Ugh.
Where I go like, nope, went the wrong way.
Yeah.
This is not happening, click.
Yeah. For me, it's dropping stones on the ground, but...
which I have seen many times.
It's very sad.
Yeah, she does drop stones on the ground.
Anyway.
Gemstones, for real.
Yeah, nothing really valuable so far, but knock on wood. Give me time.
So that was craft, which was art or wasn't art, or was time or wasn't time, and remember Luddites. Don't forget Luddites.
To sum up.
to sum up, don't forget Luddites. I don't know what we're doing next time.
Oh, we'll think of something.
We'll think of something.
See you next time.